I'd like to welcome you all to the latest presentation. Forget it, I won't welcome you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I'd like to welcome you to the latest presentation in our Tide Point monthly series. Lee Lopez is not here tonight because he's got a cold. If you're wondering how I wound up here, my wife secretly entered me in a Lee Lopez lookalike contest. The grand prize was a Beamer 750. I got an email. The grand prize in the contest was a Beamer 750. I was excited about that. I got an email yesterday saying that I won. Then when I called Lee's house to tell him I was ready to come and pick up the car, he tells me, well, there was a small problem. The dealer couldn't deliver the car in time, so you take the consolation prize, which is that I come here to take his place tonight to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Ford Hutchinson, who I have discovered most everyone in the place already knows. But I have this biography, brief biography, which you'll have to suffer through me reading it because
you skip it, Chris.
I can't. It takes me a bit to read all these things. But Ford's going to give a presentation on Hilton Head Island and the Civil War before, during, and after. Ford's background includes a BA from Dartmouth. The word is his son wouldn't let him into Fairfield, but he has an MBA from Drexel. He has 5 years serving in the U.S. Army. His business career includes 10 years with Avery International and 25 years with Combi Inc., an international privately held drug company. It's hell getting old, I have to tell you. He and his wife have lived here for 25 years. Ford spent 6 years on the board of the Deep Well board of directors, 10 years as a trustee and treasurer of the Kezar Lake, is that correct?
Right.
Kezar Lake Association in Western Maine, where his family spends their summers. He's a docent at the Coastal Discovery Museum and spoken for many times on the Civil War and its era. Please join me in welcoming him to Tide Point.
Thank you very much. I'm really flattered by how many of you showed up. I hope when I'm finished you'll have a better understanding. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A better understanding of how the Civil War impacted Hilton Head. Indeed, it was a significant event for Hilton Head. This is about a 15-minute PowerPoint show. It was developed by myself, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, without whose help I wouldn't have had a clue how to do it. I didn't have a clue. My sources for this information: the Coastal Discovery Museum, the internet, various books, the Heritage Library, the books, one of them being Robert Cars's The Department of the South. I don't know, that's an excellent book about Civil War. Another one being Low Country History by Larry Rowland. Where's Judy? Where's Judy? There she is. This is a book that Bob lent me, as you know, Judy. And he encouraged me to be a docent at the museum. And I'm glad he did, because it's an experience I've really enjoyed. And I owe it all to Bob Walker. And I have to get that book back to you. She had a nickel every time I told her that she'd be able to buy the whole diamond or something. A lot to talk about. I request that you keep your answers until the end, and we'll get going here. This is a new device, so forgive me if okay. Here is Hilton Head. No, see, I'm sorry. Here is Hilton Head. 12 miles long, 5 miles wide, Atlantic Ocean. Port Royal Sound, the second deepest sound on the East Coast, which had a very important meaning for the Union Navy. Up here we have Beaufort, the second wealthiest town in the United States before the Civil War. Wow. And it was occupied by Union troops for the duration of the war. Lucky thing, because Sherman would have burned it to the ground. Here is Port Royal, where the Emancipation Proclamation was read, January 1st, 1863. And we come down the Beaufort River over here is Skull Creek, where the Union ships were maintained and refueled. And here we have, I'm sorry guys, this is, invariably something like this happens. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to use.
You want me to help you get back to that slide?
You know what happens?
Yeah.
It's so close there. I'm not used to it. Yeah, okay. So Bluffton, the town of Bluffton, where the idea for secession took hold very firmly in the summer of 1844, and the Union troops in the summer of 1863 burned that, 2/3 of it. Here it is, Tefusky Island, and when thousands of Union soldiers were staged there to assault Fort Pulaski. Fort Pulaski guarded the entrance to Savannah, and the Union Navy knew that it had to capture and control that in order to make sure its blockade of the Savannah port was in effect. 1700s, Hilton Head was an English colony. Its first deeded landowner was for Sir John Bailey. For a long time, Hilton Head was known as Bailey's Barony. You know, if you go into Port Royal, you run across the Barony Golf Course, Barony timeshares, and livelihood centered around timber, shipbuilding, fruit, rice to some extent, but there was a lot of saltwater intrusion, so that one. But the key crop in the 1700s was this indigo. You've all heard of that, been around for centuries. The English, it was used to make a beautiful blue dye. And the English subsidized the growing of indigo on Hilton Head. And they imported 100% of it to kind of feed their textile factories that were taking off. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I show Eliza Pinckney because her experimentation with indigo seeds contributed largely to indigo's success. She is a very interesting woman, by the way. If you don't know much about her, you may want to learn more. She was really an exemplary person for her era. And indeed, her son, C.C. Pinckney, Charles Culpepper Pinckney, was a notable in his own right. He was ambassador to France. He signed the Constitution, and he ran for president in 1804 against Thomas Jefferson. After the Revolution, the English no longer imported indigo. Take that, you rebellious colonists. It was a punishment. Fortunately, the colonists, one colonist named Eliot, discovered that this plant right here, oops, I'm sorry. Whatever it is, this is so close to that joy. I'm sorry. I apologize, but what happened is my normal picker, for some reason, doesn't work. here, Joy. No, here, I'll go back. Wait till that finishes. I can't get over you this talk 100 times, never had this happen. At any rate, discovered this plant, Sea Island cotton, Gossypium barbadense. It was a South American cotton, and it grew very well in the sandy soil, subtropical conditions of Hilton Head Island, particularly when it was fertilized with marsh muck and burnt oyster shells. It was long fiber cotton, long silky fibers, 0.5 inches long. It made fine clothes, superior in value to inland cotton. And first half of the 19th century, this is what Hilton Head looked like. Vastly different than today. Great swaths of land devoted to the growing of Sea Island cotton. There were about 20 or so plantations doing it, and they were owned by families of whom many were interrelated. And interestingly, a lot of these names now are with us today, and I always like to start with Honeyhorn. That's where we are right now, where the museum is. How many have been to the museum? Oh, wow. Well, you should know now that the museum is located in a house that isn't this a shame? It's such a shame. Such a shame. I'm really embarrassed by this, guys. I feel very sorry this has happened. It's because I am not used to the advancement on this thing. Anyway, I'll continue. So Honeyhorn to then was I'm not even going to use the word. Honeyhorn then, that's my problem. Honeyhorn then was a 1,200 acre Sea Island cotton plantation. Today it's a 68 acre parcel owned by the town and leased to the museum. That house that the museum is in, it was the Graham House and built in, see if I dare do this, built in the 1850s. It is the only antebellum house now on Hilton Head Island, intact and operational. Anyway. Honeyhorn, you probably heard the story, I'll repeat it. How its name was derived, its former owner was named John Honahan. He was an indigo planter, and when pronounced, his name sounded more like Honeyhorn. Honahan. That's the story, I buy it, and I repeat it. Up here we have Pope, Squire, very wealthy planter, Squire Pope Avenue, Seabrook Retirement Community. Here's where Elliott lived. He is the one who discovered that Sea Island cotton could grow well on Hilton Head. And there's another name we know. Let's say Matthews down here. Coggins Point, the highest point on Hilton Head Island. That promontory land that William Hilton in 1663 saw when he was exploring Port Royal Sound, and he logged it as Hilton's Headland, Coggins Point. Not Conrad Hilton. I can't tell you how many people think it's Conrad Hilton. And we go on, and we have Leamington, and we know about that, Shipyard, Point Comfort, Your Neighbor, Lawton Stables, and the Stony Baynard House. We've seen this because of this. I'm sure you've all seen this in Seabrines, right? Yes. Excellent example of tabby construction. You know, tabby was cement for colonists. It was made from pure sand, pure water, burnt oyster shells, and when mixed carefully, It had the durability and strength of cement tabby. By the way, there's a story, you know, that the Baynard house, it was lost, Stoney lost the house to Baynard in a card game. Nah, inspection of the deed shows otherwise, but Sea Island cotton was very lucrative, and those who planted it became very, very wealthy, some of the wealthiest people in the United States, and you can read that, you can see why. In other words, these people were you know, grossing $3 million a year, and of course the purchasing power is much greater than that because it was all done with slave labor, and we must never forget that. And here's where you've heard this before, haven't you?
Yes,
you know, slaves had it tough, long hours, no pay, no say, marginal food, marginal housing. A lot of slaves were needed for Sea Island cotton. It had to be ginning meaning removing the cotton seeds. It had to be done by hand. Whitney's cotton gin couldn't do it, enjoy the fibers. Slaves, as you know, were a pretty monolithic group. What distinguished them was their language. It was a Creole of English and an African dialect, and it was a true language, as I will show later. And here are their quarters. This was on one of the plantations. These places were about 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, that's 240 square feet, dirt floors, and usually as many as 6 slaves lived in them. Now in the 1840s, 1850s, this Sea Island cotton aristocracy began to worry, and Britain had outlawed slavery. In the 1830s, the winds of abolition were blowing stronger and stronger, particularly when Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1850. That kind of brought to the public's consciousness the horrors and injustices of slavery. And then another thing that was happening in this period was the South began thinking that the Congress was turning against them. They didn't have their interest at heart. You know, the North was growing, but the South was not. And a particular piece of legislation that bothered them was something called the Tariff of 1842. It was an import tariff on metal, all sorts of metal, fine for northern manufacturers, but bad for planters. After all, theirs was an agrarian society. They had to import most all of their metal, and they were receiving retaliatory tariffs on their shipments of Sea Island cotton. So they were particularly upset about this. They called the tariff of 1842 the Tariff of Abomination. I don't know if you ever heard that before. Then in the mid-1840s, along comes this individual, Robert Barnwell Rhett. Have you ever heard of him? Margaret Mead did, Gone with the Wind, because I understand Rhett Butler was named after Robert Barnwell Rhett. He's a fiery South Carolina pro-slavery, pro-states' rights congressman. He organizes a convention in Bluffton in the summer of 1844 of planters and others to discuss their grievances, the tariff of 1842 being the main one. Planters came to Bluffton, and many had houses there to catch the cool breezes. I don't know, I've been in Bluffton when it's hot, never caught a cool breeze, but evidently that's why they came. And they sat under this big oak tree, and they discussed things. But after 2 days, they resolved that if they could not have the Tariff of 1842 nullified, they would have no option but to secede. And this meeting went on to be known as the Bluffton Movement. Robert Barnwell as the father of secession. That tree they sat under, the secession oak. Interesting story about that tree. I hadn't seen it 10 years ago. I drove out to Bluffton, kind of snuck on private property, took that picture, and 2 years later, the secession oak blew down. Yeah, so I'm awful glad I have that picture. So, the tariff, its provisions were ameliorated to some extent, but this idea of secession really was burning in the hearts of many of these planners, and this guy did his best to fan it. And then, I like to put it that way, in 1860, a decade and a half later, what do you think happened? South Carolina seceded from the Union. They seceded from the Union. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln, 1 month before, had been elected president on a non-extension of slavery ticket. Bad news for planners. That meant now that as new states came into the Union, the South would no longer have parity in Congress. And the handwriting was on the wall. The institution of slavery was doomed, and so was their way of life. So there were 6 who immediately followed South Carolina. It was Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. There were 4 more that joined later: Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. And there were 11 altogether. They met in February of 1861, and they formed the CSA, Confederate States of America, and elected, who did they elect? Right. President. Then something momentous happened again. Anybody tell me what it was? That was me, not this. A militia in Fort Moultrie, in the Charleston Bay, a Confederate became increasingly frustrated and annoyed by a federal garrison in Fort Sumter, which was guarding the entrance to the Charleston Bay. Fort Sumter was part of the coastal defense system. And they demanded that this federal garrison leave, abandon the fort. And when they didn't, they bombarded it. And that took place on April 12th. That started the Civil War, a great tragedy in American history. 3 days later, Lincoln called for a blockade of the entire southern coast. Why? Well, after all, these states were rebellious. They were, and he had every right to do so. The blockade of the South was known as Anaconda. That was the strategy. Winfield Scott was the one who invented it. It was the idea was you would prevent goods from coming in and out of the ports and squeeze the economy, the Confederate economy, to death. Key to this working. This is how we tie into Hilton Head. Please let me do this. Was that the southern sector of this be maintained, and that they needed a deep water port in the South to maintain and supply the southern sector of this. Immediately they had the answer: Port Royal Sound is the second deepest sound. They knew right away that they had to attack and control it, and planning for an invasion went ahead. Guarding the entrance were 2 forts, hastily built forts. They were earthen forts, Fort Beauregard and Fort Walker. Beauregard was there on Point Comfort on the other side of the bay, and Fort Walker was there on Coggins Point. Interestingly, Walker was the larger of the two forts. It had about 20 or so cannons pointed on the sound, but they were very tightly packed together, and that was bad because it made them vulnerable. They couldn't traverse. It made them vulnerable to enfilade firing. What enfilade firing is, that was Napoleon. You fire on your enemy from the side, he can't return the fire. You hit him from the flanks. At any rate, in October of 1861, a giant armada left Hampton Roads, Virginia. Virginia was under federal control then, 66 to 70 boats altogether, gunboats, troop ships, supply ships carrying lumber and cattle and horses, and the largest assembly of ships ever to take place in American water. When they got to Cape Hatteras, they hit a hurricane. And to humanize this a little bit, can you imagine now if you were a soldier? Many of these soldiers were farm boys. They had never been on a ship before. Can you imagine how terrified they must have been to run into a hurricane? But at any rate, a couple of ships were lost, some had returned, but the majority of them reassembled and went down to the mouth of Port Royal Sound. And on November 7th, 14 gunboats went into the Sound and began firing on Fort Beauregard and Fort Walker in an elliptical firing pattern. The South knew they were coming. Spies had told them so. South had no navy to speak of. They had some tugboats that were with small cannons. They were quickly driven off. The leader of the Union Navy was the Wabash, and Captain DuPont was on that boat. Huge thing, more cannons totally than Walker had. These were Dahlberg cannons used in those days, huge things. They called them 12-pounders. They were muzzle loaded, the shell in the muzzle. The shells had fuses, time to go on the air or on the ground. And they were very, very powerful guns. And this is the crew. I showed Lee Lopez this, and he said, "Man, I want to get in a bar fight with that guy." That's not true, but I thought I'd get a laugh. Anyway, I want to talk about these two individuals, Thomas Drayton and Percival Drayton. Thomas Drayton was a general. He commanded Fort Walker. It was on his property, the Drayton estate, that the Fort Walker was built. He was actually a friend of Jefferson Davis. They had gone to West Point together. His younger brother, Percival, had grown up in Philadelphia, and he was a Navy captain. Now here they were firing on each other, trying to kill each other. A classic brother versus brother story of the Civil War. Each Civil War, each fighting for causes they believed in. The battle started, it went on for about 5 hours. There was cannon fire. Nope, there isn't. It went on for about 5 hours. Joy, are you here?
Yeah.
I don't care about the camera. Later, I'm going to need your help. And went on about 5 hours. Started at 9 and was over by 2. Both forts were hopelessly outgunned. Fort Walker suffered a lot from enfilade firing. And when both forts were abandoned at about after 5 hours, and when they were, well, you're supposed to hear soldiers yelling and screaming and rushing ashore there. Thousands of soldiers went ashore and captured Hilton Head, and a week later they went up to Beaufort and captured Beaufort with no resistance. When word got out that the landing had happened, plantation owners fled. They left everything behind. They left all the possessions, and they left their slaves behind. The slaves fled the opposite way. They fled to the Union Army for asylum. This would present a big problem for the Union Army, as I'll discuss later. I've included this letter. It's an actual letter written, I really don't know who it was, but to kind of, about a soldier coming ashore, describing what he saw, and I put it in there to humanize, what I've been talking about, and also, we must try never to forget how violent war is. And so I'll read this for you, a little tough to read. It says, "To see the shells exploding and sand and water flying was awful to see. And when we stepped on land, what a sight to see men shattered to pieces. To what extent the rebels suffered is not known. Our boys was 11 killed aboard the gunboat Wabash, which was one of the principals in the fight. There was 14 boats engaged, actually it was more like 16 in the fight, and then the next day David and I walked out to see around, and we found in an old shanty a rebel with his leg shot off. We stood and looked at him a few minutes. I think I'd never seen a poor creature suffer so much in my life, but death relieved him of his pain whilst we were there. In fact, there were about 100 casualties in the Battle of Port Royal. The South suffered much worse than the North. Now, I'd like to just pause here because you need to take stock where we are. It's the beginning of 1862. What's happened? Well, the North has captured and is in control of Beaufort, of Port Royal Sound, of Hilton Head. It is known as the Department of the South. Hilton Head is known now as Port Royal, not to be confused with the Port Royal that I showed you. This occupation of Union soldiers, sailors, and Marines would grow to over 40,000 people in the years that they were here. Over 40,000. You know, Hilton Head today is roughly, year-round, is roughly 40,000, not including visitors. Yeah, they're... The commander of the Union occupation was General Thomas Sherman, no relation to William Tecumseh. Lee knew him. Lee knew him. They had campaigned together. He was known as the building general, and build he did, and those who followed him. I'm going to show you pictures, all of which were taken on Hilton Head by a New Hampshire photographer in the years 1863, 1864. This is a wharf that went out about 1/3 of the mile into the bay. That's called Port Royal. All buildings that were once here, gone of course, because when the Union Army left, they dismantled them, took back the lumber, and what was left native islanders scavenged. The Drake, remember I said they were related? The Briggs and the Popes were related. Those are warehouses, and this would be where Port Royal Golf Club is now. About 2 years later, they actually built a house for reporters and dignitaries and their wives. They built a hotel rather. This is the initial Union encampment, but later, all these tents were arranged in orderly rows, separated by avenues in a grid pattern. I'll show you what that looks like later. And an army band. I have sound, joyous sound. Oh, you can hear it. Okay. Here's one of the band members. His name is Klein. He's a New Hampshire kid, and he writes back. And it was like, yeah, it was all staged, you know, palm fronds and Welsh. And he said, you know, things aren't so bad here. But what he hadn't been here long enough to realize is hot climate, mosquitoes, flies, and sand fleas. When you read accounts of soldiers camping out here in Hilton, the sand fleas were a scourge. They were just really, they bit them, it really hurt. And of course, there was malaria and yellow fever. General Ormsby Mitchell died of yellow fever, actually. There's a general hospital. This hospital, all gone now, this was 160,000 square feet. It was built square. Each side was 400 feet long, but inside it was open. But altogether it was, and they were like 160,000 square feet. And cemetery, you might have visited there. No more graves out there. They were all dug up, reinterred in the Beaufort Memorial, War Memorial Cemetery. Now, in addition to building out the encampment, Sherman had other things to worry about. He had to worry about counterattack. He had to worry about the capture of Fort Pulaski, as I mentioned to you before. What to do with all these idle, hundreds and hundreds of idle male slaves, and he had to address the needs of the slaves. They came to the Union Army, most of them with just only clothes on their back. So with regard to counterattack, he, and this is dangerous, here I go. The first thing he did was to build a stockade wall around the encampment. If you go out there today to Port Royal and have a tour, this will be known as Fort Sherman. The second thing he did was to build a battery overlooking Skull Creek, and this is where the ships were maintained and fueled. This today is called Fort Mitchell. The old Fort Pub was there. Fortunately, it's not there anymore. I love that place. And then, yeah, and then we have, this is Fort Holbrook. This is back of the Spanish Wells Golf Course. I don't know if you've ever been there. There's a huge ditch back there. That was a moat that the Union Army dug. There's a story about Tom Jones and that moat, but I won't go into that, Tom, I promise. That's a little joke. Tom, myself, and God love him, Bob Water. And down here, in Sea Pines, the Baynard Battery. And interesting, when you go down there, you see military names, like Wagon and Gunnery. That's because the battery was there. Interesting, the South never counterattacked. The Union was too firmly attached. The troops on Hilton Head were engaged in 4 battles, 2 to try to capture the Charleston Railroad. That was called the Battle of Honey Hill and the Battle of Pocatagio. The Union did attack Bluffton in the summer of 1863, and they burned 2/3 of Bluffton. But the big battle, the big important battle, was the Battle of Fort Pulaski. And Fort Pulaski, as I mentioned, was guarding the entrance to Savannah. It was thought to be impregnable. It had been built in the 1830s as part of the coastal defense system. Big, thick masonry walls, guns pointing in all directions. 1 mile, it was in the center of the wet, 1 mile from either shore, and they thought that it was out of reach of cannon. However, what they didn't know is that the Union now had rifled cannons, Parrott guns, which were rifled, and they could fire shells that would go much further than a mile. And General Quincy Gilmore laid siege to this. He later became known worldwide as the General of Siege. Very carefully at night on Tybee Island, he put in batteries of rifled cannons pointed at Fort Pulaski. They knew something was going on in the fort, but they couldn't figure out what. Then, almost 1 year after the Battle of the Sumter, the command fire was given, and the Union started to fire on Fort Pulaski, and they couldn't believe what was happening. The southwest side of the southeast side of the fort was systematically being destroyed. And after 30 hours, they surrendered. One Union shell came close, dangerously close to the magazine, and they were worried that the fort wouldn't go. This was a huge victory for the North. It saved the lives of about 10,000 soldiers who were staged to assault it. And it also brought a significant architectural, technological realization that masonry forts were no longer adequate for coastal defense. Next, we go to what we did with slaves. Well, General Hunter, who relieved General Sherman, took it upon himself to organize the slaves. He declared the male slaves, he declared them free, and he enlisted them in the 1st South Carolina Regiment. It was the first black fighting unit to become part of the armed forces. However, when Lincoln heard this, he did this in April of 1862, he was angry with Hunter. 1, Hunter had not gotten his permission to do it, and 2, Lincoln was very worried at this point in the war that arming slaves would alarm slave states that had slave that had not joined the Confederacy and caused them to do so. Lincoln didn't want any more states joining the Confederacy, so he ordered Hunter to disband this 1st South Carolina Regiment. He did so, but about 6 months later, when the Emancipation Proclamation came out, they were reassembled, and they went on to fight valiantly. They became the 33rd. There they are at Fort Saxon, that is over there in Port Royal. And remember, it's not the 53rd Massachusetts, it is the 1st Carolina, I was in the movie Glory, 1st Carolina Regiment, the 1st Black Fighting Unit. Humanitarian crisis. This was, went to Secretary of Treasury Chase. Now, why would it go to the Secretary of Treasury? You think it would go to the War and War Department? Because slaves were contraband. They were considered property. It was treasuries. So he sent somebody down and they pierced to survey the situation, and they came up with a very enlightened policy. Please remember, this is the keystone of really Reconstruction. The Port Royal experiment, one, allowed slaves to continue working. They weren't crazy about that, at least they had something to do. And they received wages. First time ever they were paid. With these wages, they could buy land that the Union had confiscated, and they put that up from auction from time to time. I'll go into that a little bit later. They were to be educated, and they were to receive adequate housing. The education fell to volunteers from the North. The most famous was Laura Town. Have you ever heard of her, Laura Town? She started the Penn School in Frogmore, that's on St. Helena Island. She came down and found this church. Again, I'm not going to point to it, but this abandoned church, and set up a school. And she began teaching slaves. So this is really the first public education of African Americans in the United States, right here, Laura Town. This has now become part of the National Park Service, and Pat Conroy is buried right in back of that, by the way. And what else is there? Martin Luther King planned two of his movements right there. He felt very safe when he was there. Laura Town, called Penn because she was from Pennsylvania. Next, we have Mitchellville. Mitchellville was the idea that Ormsby Mitchell, the third commanding general, came up with in late 1862. And here are all these slaves that were in barracks, very bad situation. He came up with the idea, why not set aside a tract of land north of the encampment, about 3 miles long, 1 mile wide. This, by the way, now, today, is Beach City Road, right there. Well, Beach City Road, and let slaves build their own buildings. They were capable of that. Many of them were skilled carpenters, and let them self-govern. And you know what? They did, and they did it marvelously. And Mitchellville was a great success, and is known now as the first community in which freedmen self-governed. Think of that, remarkable, because slaves had no education. They were never allowed to assemble in groups greater than 15, and yet they found the ability to organize themselves, make laws, appoint leaders, and for Mitchellville. Mitchellville today, of course, is not nearly this large. It is only about that large, and there's a big effort now to make sure that Mitchellville is not, we're going to call it Mitchellville Historic Park, and they're trying to raise money, as you probably know. This is these are Mitchellville. Now, they're not fancy, but these slaves built them themselves. They were very proud of them. This, by the way, is Queen Anne Chapel on Beach City Road. AME ministers built that in 1864. This is Fort Howell. This was built to protect, in 1864, to protect Mitchellville. And here, as I said, here's what it looked like, Department of the South and Atlantic Ocean. There's that wharf that I pointed out to you. This is the 160,000 square foot hospital, officers' quarters, engineer quarters, provost here. There's Fort Walker. It was rebuilt and named Fort Wells, provide protection from counterattack from the sea, and all sorts of buildings where this is Sutler's Row. The soldiers called this Robbers Row because they were being taken advantage of. That's how that name would go. And here's the encampment. The Union Army stayed 3 years after the war and to try to get Reconstruction off to a good start. They didn't leave until 1868. Mitchellville, which had grown to about 2,500 people, declined because many of the jobs went with the Union Army. Owners did not return. They were unable to pay back taxes, and those taxes were part of the Revenue Act of 1863, in which if taxes were, federal tax, if taxes were not paid, the government had the right to seize, to confiscate that property. And Nan Lloyd, I told her I'm going to bring you up, but I thought, you and I went to a talk about 3 or 4 weeks ago and learned that Honeyhorn was actually bought and sold. It was confiscated and bought and sold about 4 times between 1863, 64, and 1870. But and Nan and I learned that there is a lot of evidence that this was, the buyers and sellers were part of the Cuban Revolution. And they were hiding money, they were laundering money from the Spanish. Kind of interesting. Sorry, Nan, I went. By the way, if you haven't been out, you have to go out and walk the Nan Lloyd Nature Trail. It is a very serene wooded path that goes around the perimeter of the museum, and it's named in her honor. And I hope it doesn't embarrass you, Nan, but I wanted to bring that recognition to you. Okay. 1870s beyond. How am I doing time-wise?
About 15 minutes.
Good. I'm told that I get shot at 6 o'clock. Now, owners didn't come back in the 1870s, but who did? The Gullah did. And who were the Gullah? They were emancipated slaves. They came back, and so-called Gullah because they tied their heritage, many of them tied their heritage to Angola. And they migrated to the coastal area between really Wilmington and all the way down to Jacksonville, and particularly in the Sea Islands. And this was called the Gullah-Geechee Corridor. North of the Savannah River were the Gullah, south were the Geechee. And they loved the Sea Islands particularly because they felt isolated, they felt independent, they felt free to practice their own customs, which were heavily Africanized. And today, we recognize the Gullah by their paintings and by their food. Food and often you'll see these paintings and they're happy and they're colorful and they're whimsical. And why not? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment made them free and citizens with the right to vote. And it was a happy time for them. They were called the farmers of the land, farmers of the sea. They caught oysters and fish and crabs and shrimp. And what they couldn't use themselves, they sold at market. Now I'm going to ask something that nobody seems to ever come up with the answer. Why do you often see in Gullah paintings blank black faces? Blank black faces. It's because it's to show they had, as slaves, they had been stripped of their identity. And that, we know Gullah because Sweetgrass done marvelous things. I'm sure some of you own them. There's a lot of skill to do it. This is a custom that went back 1,000 years and really was men who did it. They originally did it as winnowing, rice winnowing fans, and that involved into these baskets. And can anybody tell me what goes in these baskets? Palm, rush, long leaf pine needle, and sweetgrass. Those 4 things go in. Oh, by the way, I asked, I'm gonna need the sound for this one too, Julie. I asked, I asked one of the master weavers out there whether he thought that there was a future for these. He said, no, the young people do not want to do that. So at some time or other. Now, I told you that it was that Gullah was an actual language, and indeed it is. And it is taught at Harvard as part of the Harvard language program, and this individual, Sun Michaud, is going to explain to you. Now, Sun doesn't like to talk sometimes, but I'm going to try to make him do that. Can you turn it up loud?
Born and raised Jackson, South Carolina, native from coming out all the way for Ireland to teach one off the country. We have to get you people get it. See, for the first time in the whole history, Berlin teaches a course in the African language program at Howard University, bring out with Dr. John Montgomery. Smart man that. And she hates, he talking about the letting that video. The wife is going to get with the African language, because that's where he is. He ain't just walk up talk now. Gotta be on syntax, spelling, grammar, even words you know. So she'll catch it from the West African roots. Words such as kumbaya. Everybody has seen kumbaya when they were in the way. Me, kumbaya. Wait for the slave ancestor, the president fought for coming by the head and freedom. Hence, the words for this song, kumbaya, my God, kumbaya. I say, come by here, my Lord, come by here. See? I ain't doing too much. We want to not know who that will come take because Harvard University African Language Program with Sun Michaud. I did it. You look at me.
Sounds like a pretty nice guy. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, I'm almost finished now, but a couple more things I wanted to point out, and that is that in the first half of the 20th century, Hilton Head went through another era called the hunting era. And this is when wealthy Northerners came down and bought thousands of acres of land between Charleston and Savannah, and they turned it into hunting preserves, primarily birds that, as you can see, some of the names were Doubleday, DuPont, Hutton, Chris. That's a pretty good book explaining it if you're interested in learning more. Here on Honeyhorn, a fellow by the name of Clyde, he was a steamship operator, bought Honeyhorn, and he turned it into a hunting preserve. And he also bought a lot of land until he had 9,000 acres. He was well thought of, he was well received, he provided jobs for Native Islanders. And he even worked with Booker T. Washington to try to establish an agricultural training school to help Gullahs farm more productively. The Gullahs didn't want any part of it. They said, no thank you, we've been told what to do long enough. We don't need that. Clyde was there about 30 years and then sold it to a wealthy New Yorker for $10,000. All Honeyhorn, $10,000. To Roy Rainey lost his money in the Depression and sold it to two wealthy New York people, Landon Thorne and Alfred Loomis. Have you heard of them? I'm sure you probably have. They bought Honeyhorn in 1930. They were brother-in-laws. They were known as the fathers of rural electrification. They had financed many utilities, like Clyde. They turned Honeyhorn into a hunting preserve. They entertained lavishly. They built several buildings on the campus. One of which was a chapel, which later was moved to the First Presbyterian Church across from the fire department. Remember that little white building?
Yes.
Loomis and Thorne built that building as a chapel for their visitors. Loomis was a physicist of renown. The book written about him called Tuxedo Park, and he contributed greatly to the development of radar in World War II. He invented the electroencephalograph, And he actually worked on the Manhattan Project. They were brother-in-laws. After about 20 years, their relationship grew thorny, grew prickly, because Loomis became more interested in his secretary than Thorne's sister, who was his wife. And so, I like to point out, so now we not only have foreign intrigue as an element of Honeyhorn history, we have marital infidelity. Should make a movie out of it. Yeah, just kidding. Loomis and Thorne in '50 sold their property to lumbermen from Hutchinson, Georgia, and the principals being Hack and Fraser. They sold it for $1,100,000. $1,100,000.
Price went up.
Mr. Hack they timbered it for 3 years of timbered extensively, primarily oak and pine. But after 3 years, they turned to development. Hack took the northern end of Hilton Head. He built a shipyard, he built Port Royal, very generously donated land for the fire department, hospital, so forth. And he raised his family at Honeyhorn. It was the Hack estate that sold Honeyhorn to the town. Fraser, General Fraser, sold his portion to Charles. And Charles was a young law school graduate, and he had a vision, and his vision his vision was to develop the southern end of Hilton Head according to a plan, and together with Harvard landscape architect Hideo Sasaki, they together developed this plan, grand plan, which called for buildings to blend in with the environment, connected by winding roads and bike trails. One plan which would preserve trees, preserve historical sites, preserve environmentally sensitive sites, and all be governed by very strict covenants, real estate laws in perpetuity. That is what you call sea pines today, and is considered the gold standard of resort and residential living. Charles Fraser was killed tragically in a boating accident in 2003. If you go to Hilton Head, go to the big look down, that's where Charles Fraser is. Okay, 3 more minutes. Don't shoot now, I'm almost finished. I wanted to recap, I want to point out some of the firsts that I've gone over, okay? South Carolina was the first to secede, all right? The Battle of Port Royal was the largest battle ever to take place in American water, and still holds that distinction. The 1st Carolina Regiment was the first black unit to officially first, to join the United States military. The Penn School was the first time that African Americans were publicly educated. Mitchellville, the first self-governed freedmen community. And there's one more. The Civil War was tragic. 800,000 lives, really more, 600,000 to 700,000 lives were lost. But it had to be fought. It was a noble war. And nobody explained it better than Abraham Lincoln on November 19th, 1863, to an assemblage of people at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And he told them, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We were met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. And it's altogether fitting and proper that we do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow, we cannot dedicate this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, will long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated to the unfinished work which they thus far have so nobly advanced. It is for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new reign of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from earth. Abraham Lincoln. I wish we had leaders like him today. Thank you very much. I tell you, I've been this talk many, many times, and as I told Patsy,